Power did not slip from Rome in a single night. It leaked away through decades of mistrust, civil war, and bought loyalties until the empire learned, the hard way, that an emperor could be made in a barracks as easily as in the Senate. The lesson had been written in blood long before Constantine. In the year 193, the world watched Rome's throne become a prize dragged through the streets. Pertinax murdered by the very guards sworn to protect him, the imperial dignity auctioned to Didius Julianus as though it were an estate, and legions on distant frontiers raising rival claimants with clenched fists and drawn steel. That year, later remembered as the Year of the Five Emperors, did not merely expose instability, it announced a terrifying truth: the center could no longer hold. A century later, emperors tried to repair that fracture with the Tetrarchy, dividing power among four rulers to prevent another 193. Yet division bred its own violence. When that system imploded and Constantine emerged as sole ruler after 313, it was not simply a victory over rivals, it was a refounding of how Rome would be ruled. The old imperial balance, Rome as the heart, Italy as the stage, the Senate as the antique ornament, began to tilt eastward. And out of Rome's unprecedented decline, a phoenix city rose on. The Bosporus, a new capital built not merely to govern an empire, but to outlast its fall. The question that haunts the centuries is not why the West collapsed, but how. The East endured, and what blueprint was laid down at the moment? Constantine gathered the fragments of a shattered system and forged them into something else. The Tetrarchy had been designed as a machine, not a dynasty. It offered order through multiplication. Two senior emperors, two juniors, each responsible for a slice of the world, each meant to hand authority to the next in a controlled succession. For a time it worked, not because it was beloved, but because fear enforced it. But it asked men to surrender ambition, and ambition was the one currency no edict could debase. When Diocletian stepped down, the mechanism began to grind. Claimants rose not by lawful transfer, but by acclamation, intrigue, and war. The empire, exhausted by decades of crises, found itself again staring into the abyss that 193 had opened, where legitimacy was measured in marching boots. Constantine mastered that abyss. He did not simply defeat opponents, he dismantled the very notion that the empire could be governed as a partnership of equals. The old collegiate principle, celebrated as stability, became to him an invitation to perpetual civil war. Under his rule, the administration tightened around a single center. The language of unity returned, but it was unity under one will. To achieve this, Constantine reshaped the bureaucracy as if reforging a sword. Provinces that had once enjoyed the wide discretion of distance were broken into smaller units, making governors less dangerous and more dependent. Regional autonomy narrowed, the imperial court grew. Power flowed not outward from Rome's old civic institutions, but inward toward the emperor's household, his advisors, his secretaries, his fiscal agents, men whose rank was not inherited from ancient families but granted by imperial favor. The court became a moving capital even before Constantinople was stone, a place where access mattered more than pedigree and proximity mattered more than tradition. His officials were not merely administrators, they were instruments. Loyal men were placed where loyalties mattered, in the collection of taxes, in the supervision of supplies, in the oversight of justice, in the communication lines that kept provinces tethered to the throne. The empire began to resemble a nervous system with the emperor as its brain, messages and money traveling along controlled channels. Even the symbolism of government changed. The emperor's presence, his rituals, his carefully managed distance from ordinary life turned sovereignty into something both sacred and unapproachable, less a magistrate of Rome and more the living embodiment of the state. And then came the grandest symbol of all, a new capital. Constantinople was not planned as a provincial city elevated by whim. It was conceived as a deliberate break with the gravitational pull of Rome, which had become heavy with memories. pagan rites, senatorial resistance, and a geography that no longer matched imperial necessity. Rome still had monuments, but it no longer had command of the most vital frontiers. The Danube, the Euphrates, the trade arteries of the east, and the grain routes that fed the cities, these were the pressure points of survival. Constantine did not abandon Rome out of disdain. He surpassed it out of calculation. Economic reform was the silent partner to these political changes. The empire's finances had suffered for generations, and a government cannot be centralized on sentiment alone. Constantine moved toward stabilizing currency and strengthening fiscal policy so that the state could pay soldiers, build defenses, and keep the machinery of court and province functioning in harmony. But he also pursued something more profound: allegiance. By integrating Christian leadership into the imperial framework, granting bishops a recognized role in social order and moral authority, he tied faith to the stability of government. The result was not immediate uniformity, the religious landscape remained contested and complex. Yet it created a new architecture of loyalty that did not depend on the old Roman civic religion. The empire was being remade, but remaking requires resources, and resources require trust. Trust in coin, in law, in the permanence of the state. To understand how Constantine could build a city meant to outlive empires, the story must descend into the hard metal of money and the disciplined geometry of armies. Before Constantine, the empire's fiscal life had been poisoned slowly, like water tainted upstream. Generations of crisis had forced emperors to pay for war with promises stamped on increasingly worthless metal. Coinage had been debased, inflation had surged, and prices had become unstable enough to corrode the simplest transactions. In such an atmosphere, taxes were harder to collect, soldiers were harder to satisfy, and merchants learned to distrust the imperial stamp. The state's authority, so loudly proclaimed in marble, was quietly undermined in marketplaces and pay lines. Constantine's answer was not an edict against greed or a moral appeal to patience. It was the solidus, a gold coin of remarkable purity and consistency. In an empire where confidence had become rare, the solidus was a declaration that the state could still guarantee value. Its impact was immediate, not only because gold is desirable, but because consistency is power. With a stable standard, contracts could be made with less fear. Taxes could be assessed with clearer expectations. Soldiers could be paid in a coin that held its worth beyond the next crisis. Over time, the solidus became more than currency. It became a language spoken across borders, a gold standard for centuries. In the East, especially, where trade networks connected the Mediterranean to Asia and Africa, that stability nurtured a resilient economy. It allowed Constantinople to become not merely an administrative center, but a financial heart, pulsing reliable coin into the veins of commerce. Yet coin alone does not hold an empire. The year 193 had proved what happens when the army decides emperors are interchangeable. Constantine understood that the military had to be both effective against enemies and less capable of casually crowning rivals. The old Roman legion, heavy infantry formations tied to particular regions, and traditions had been a symbol of Roman dominance, but the empire of the 4th century faced threats that moved quickly, struck unexpectedly, and exploited any delay. Constantine's reforms encouraged the rise of mobile field armies, the comitatenses, forces designed to respond rapidly across great distances. They were not meant to replace border troops entirely, but to complement them, a central reserve that could be hurled toward a breach, a rebellion, a sudden invasion. It was a strategic shift born of hard geography. The empire's borders were too long for a single static defense, and its internal stability too fragile to allow local commanders unlimited power with concentrated forces. This new military hierarchy, more layered, more differentiated, changed the very rhythm of imperial warfare. Border forces watched and delayed. Field armies moved and struck. Command became a matter not merely of valor, but of coordination, supply, and rapid intelligence. To make this system work, Constantine invested in fortifying the frontiers. Strongholds, walls, and fortified cities were not just stone barriers. They were nodes in a network meant to slow invaders, protect supply lines, and buy time for mobile forces to arrive. The concept was not always called by later terms, but the principle resembled defense in depth. The border was not a single line to be shattered, but a layered space where an enemy could be worn down, diverted, and contained. Stone and gold, bureaucracy, and army, these were the foundations of endurance. They did not guarantee peace, but they made survival more likely. And as the empire's machinery grew more centralized and its currency more trusted, one city, still under construction, still rising with scaffolds and dust, began to draw the world toward it like iron to a lodestone. The stage was set for Constantinople to become the empire's economic nexus, not by proclamation alone, but by the irresistible gravity of function. Constantinople was founded with an eye toward the sea and the map of the world. Its position was a masterstroke, poised on the Bosporus, commanding the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, standing at the meeting point of Europe and Asia. Ships that carried grain, timber, slaves, silk, spices, and coin could be monitored, taxed, protected, or blocked. Armies moving between continents found the city a natural gate. Few places on earth offered such a union of trade and defense. The city's harbors became arms reaching into the currents of commerce. Its walls and waters made it difficult to seize, while its markets made it impossible to ignore. Merchants followed security and profit. Officials followed revenue. Artists and builders followed patronage. Wealth gathered where it could be defended. This was not merely a matter of geography. Constantine's reforms ensured that the fiscal life of the empire could feed the city's growth. Stable currency encouraged trade, centralized administration made extraction and redistribution more efficient. The court's presence attracted luxury and labor. Constantinople became a magnet not because it was beautiful, though it would become so, but because it was useful. And while the East consolidated, the West drifted into a different current. The Western provinces faced their own pressures: repeated incursions, contested successions, and strained resources. The economic stability that gold and trade offered the East was harder to replicate, where frontiers were more exposed and revenue streams less robust. The divergence was not instantaneous and it was not absolute, but it was cumulative. Each crisis in the West deepened dependency on improvisation. Each successful reform in the East strengthened continuity. Constantine's innovations did not create an immortal state, but they created habits of survival. They left behind a blueprint: stable coin, a responsive army, layered defenses, and a capital placed where the world's wealth could be watched and harnessed. The name Byzantine would come later, a label given by scholars to an empire that called itself Roman to the end. But the shape of that later empire, its resilience, its administrative sophistication, its ability to endure when the West fell away, was already forming in the stone courses of Constantinople's walls. To understand why the city could become more than a capital, more than a symbol, it is necessary to return to what it had been before Constantine touched it: a modest Greek settlement that seemed at first glance an unlikely heir to Rome's grandeur. And yet, within that smallness, there was a strategic appeal that emperors had sought since the Panic of Years, like 193, taught them that the center of power must never again be so vulnerable. Byzantium began as an unassuming city with a legacy older than Rome's empire, but far less glorious in imperial memory. It sat where currents converged and where the land narrowed, a place defined by its straits. The Bosporus was not only water, it was a lever that could move economies. Whoever held it could influence the flow of goods from the grain-rich shores of the Black Sea and the trade arteries that reached deep into Asia. Constantine saw more than a port. He saw a throne anchored in geography. Rome, for all its grandeur, was increasingly distant from the empire's most critical zones. The richest provinces lay in the east. The most persistent rival powers pressed along eastern frontiers. The Danube and the Balkans demanded constant attention. Byzantium sat within reach of all of it, able to look toward Europe and Asia with equal ease. But there was another appeal, quieter yet decisive, a chance to create a capital unburdened by Rome's past. Rome was saturated with old cults, old families, old expectations. It was a city where every stone remembered a republic, where every ceremony echoed a pagan antiquity. Constantine did not erase that past, but he chose not to be imprisoned by it. In Byzantium, he could build a city that reflected a different imperial identity, an imperial center where Christian patronage could be woven into civic life and where the emperor's authority could be staged without constant negotiation with Rome's senatorial ghosts. Geography favored him. Water protected the city on multiple sides. The Golden Horn offered a sheltered harbor. The straits could be controlled with fleets and fortifications. The city stood close to the granaries, markets, and tax bases of the East, where the imperial treasury could be fed more reliably. It was a nexus not only of roads and sea lanes, but of resources and response time. The birth of Constantinople as a metropolis was an undertaking of astonishing speed and scale. Quarries were emptied, timber was dragged across distances, laborers, artisans, and engineers converged under imperial command. The city rose not as a slow accumulation of generations, but as a state project, a declaration in stone that the empire's axis had shifted. Architectural marvels followed the logic of both Roman tradition and Eastern influence. The Hippodrome was more than an arena, it was a political chamber in motion, a place where crowds gathered, factions formed, and imperial presence could be displayed and tested. The imperial palace anchored the city's ceremonial life, tying the ruler to the skyline itself. Streets, forums, and public buildings were laid out with the confidence of an empire determined to look eternal. Yet Constantinople was not meant to be merely functional. It needed legitimacy. The transfer of power required more than troops and taxes. It required symbols that could persuade. Art and relics were moved from older centers. Senators were encouraged, sometimes pressured, to relocate. The city was filled with imported prestige, as though the empire were transplanting its own organs into a new body. The intent was clear. This was not a rival to Rome, it was Rome's continuation newly placed. What followed across centuries proved the genius and the cost of that decision. Constantinople became a fortress of 1,000 years, a city whose walls, rebuilt and strengthened, could defy sieges that would have shattered lesser capitals. It stood as a bulwark against invasions that might otherwise have poured into the Mediterranean world unchecked. Within its defenses, Roman law endured, imperial administration matured, and learning was preserved and transformed. The city became an engine of art, architecture, scholarship, and diplomacy, shaping the cultures of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, long after the Western Empire fractured. Even its end carried the weight of an epoch. In 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans, it did not vanish into insignificance. Its libraries, scholars, and memories traveled outward, and its strategic position remained valuable to every power that came after. The Phoenix City had bowed at last, but it had already reshaped the trajectory of world history by proving that Rome could survive without Rome. And beneath that long endurance lay Constantine's original wager that an empire could be made stronger by moving its heart, disciplining its finances, reforming its armies, and binding its legitimacy to a new spiritual and administrative order. Yet the story does not end in triumph alone. The same forces that demanded these reforms, succession crises, military ambition, economic strain, never truly disappeared. They merely changed form. The final reflection belongs not to marble or gold, but to the human hunger for stability in a world that repeatedly dissolves into uncertainty. In the year 193, Rome learned the price of a throne without a system. An emperor was murdered. Another purchased power, and the provinces answered with marching legions. The city that had once ruled the world discovered that its own guardians could sell its future. That tension between authority and violence, legitimacy and force, never left the imperial story. It haunted the empire through the 3rd century's disasters, through the desperate invention of the Tetrarchy, through its collapse into civil war. Constantine's achievement was not the creation of perfection, but the construction of endurance. He recognized that the empire could not rely on ancient prestige to hold armies, provinces, and economies together. It needed a bureaucracy that answered to one center, a currency that restored trust, a military that could move as swiftly as threats arose, and a capital positioned like a clasp on the world's trade routes. He did not merely rule, he redesigned the instrument of rule. The result was a paradox that would shape a millennium. By abandoning Rome as the practical heart of government, Constantine preserved Rome as an idea. The West would falter under pressures that no single reform could fully repel, but the East, fortified, monetized, centralized, would carry the Roman name forward in a new form. The blueprint was neither purely Christian nor purely Roman. It was imperial survival, written in policy, architecture, and steel. Empires are often remembered for their conquests, but they are defined by the moments when they choose what to save. Constantine saved the empire by moving it, by hardening it, by giving it a city built to resist time. And in that decision, made after centuries of warning and years of civil war, the ancient world turned on its axis, until the title of Rome belonged not to the Tiber's fading grandeur, but to a shining capital on the Bosporus where power learned to live behind walls and within systems, and where history itself seemed to be rebuilt from the foundations up.